Now we have Steve Blank. So Steve, thank you very, very much for coming down.
Thanks, Chris.
And talking with us today. We've got some water there if you need it. Please, people at the back, there are some seats if you want to come and grab a seat. Otherwise, we will get underway. We've got about 40 minutes to have a chat. And
I'm not sure I could fill up 40 minutes.
No, you can. You absolutely can. Steve has been very gracious to myself and SVForum over the years, helping us out by talking at a number of the events we've had. And I thought it was a good thing to ask Steve to come along today to talk about what he's learned between the first book, the 4 Steps of the Epiphany, and his new one, the Startup Owner's Manual. Some of the people who came in today have red stars on their badges. Would you all put your hands up if you've got red stars? If you've got red stars, you get a free copy of this book. Ooh.
That's the second prize. The first prize is you don't get a book. Yeah.
You get a free copy of this book, and more than that, Steve has graciously agreed that he will sign copies for anybody who wants that. He will be at the break in the lobby there to sign the copies of the books for you, should you wish. So, with that in mind, going forward, what have you learned from going from 4 Steps to the Epiphany to the Startup Owner's Manual?
You know, Chris, that's a 10-year question, and since we have 40 minutes, I'll try to make it short. You know, how many of you have read the 4 Steps to the Epiphany, or at least heard of it? And about half of you. So the 4 Steps to the Epiphany was the beginning of now what's called the lean startup movement. I had done 8 startups in 21 years in Silicon Valley. A couple semiconductor companies, enterprise software, video games, military intelligence company, stuff I don't even remember, with a box score of 4 IPOs, a couple singles, and 2 craters so deep they left their own iridium layer. You know, and that definition is the high point of that company is you end up on the cover of Wired just as you're blowing $40 million of investors' money. And that was an iridium layer. But when I retired, I had some time to reflect. And the reflection really made me think is that back in 2000, that the common wisdom of the last 30 years of venture capital of how to build early stage ventures was just simply wrong. It used to be, you know, VCs said, you know, you write a plan, you have a concept, you do alpha test, beta test, first customer ship, and you hire sales and marketing and biz dev. And in hindsight, I just believed we were wrong. And I had kind of began to formulate some of these ideas in a class I was teaching in Berkeley, and my class notes were something I handed out to my students. And I had a set of students who were auditing the class because I was funding their company and sitting on their board, and one of those students was a guy named Eric Rees. Anybody read Eric's stuff? Eric suggested that perhaps I, instead of Xeroxing class notes, ought to make people pay for them by putting a cover on it and putting it on Amazon, which is why Eric is a much smarter entrepreneur than I am. And that became the 4 Steps to the Epiphany. And it became a pride of ownership that for 10 years people were buying this thing with completely unfinished sentences, so you could make up your own strategy as you went along. And the Startup Owner's Manual was kind of the result of actually thinking through another decade. But the biggest insight, both then and now, I didn't quite understand what we were talking about, and was why startups were really different than large companies, and what it was that VCs for the first 40 years had us doing and why it was wrong. And can I give you a minute on that? Yeah. You know, when investors came to Silicon Valley in the 60s and 70s, most of their backgrounds were MBAs or financial people. There were a few who actually did startups, but most had kind of a what I'd call a management background from large companies or financial institutions. And, you know, startups, how hard can they be? A couple of people in a room, you know, we know how to manage large companies. Startups implicitly became nothing more than smaller versions of large companies. Large companies hire sales, marketing, and biz dev on day one. Well, we'll tell our startups to do that. Large companies write business plans. We'll tell our startups to do that. Large companies do 5-year forecasts, just like the Soviet Union used to do 5-year plans. We'll tell our startups to go do that. Somehow magically thinking that all we needed to do was write it down and execute the plan. Now, for some of you who've anybody ever write a business plan? Right? Anybody ever discover that no business plan survives first contact with customers? Right? Yet, the VCs kind of know that, but they made you write them every year. In fact, that's still, in a number of firms, the price of entry into the firm. And the reason why is, while they kind of knew that, they didn't quite know, well, okay, if this is wrong, what is it we should do instead? And that really was, I think, my contribution to the 4 Steps to the Epiphany, and even more so in the Startup Owner's Manual. And here's the distinction. Large companies, as a whole, execute known business models. But what startups do in your first year, you're searching for a repeatable and scalable business model. And this distinction between execution and search is what makes founders different than large company executives. This is why you get fired when it's time to execute, but it's why large company executives can't do what you do on day one. And so that distinction between execution and search now raises a whole set of questions. Is, okay, Steve, I kind of get that. That's a nice phrase, search for a business model. First of all, what's search? And second of all, what's a business model? And about 4 years ago, there was a guy named Alexander Osterwalder who defined, I think, perfectly what a business model is. He said, listen, a business model are all the pieces you need to know about what makes up your company to help you create value and make money. What is it? And he said, listen, business model for any company has, who are the customers? What are you offering them? Called the value proposition, whether it's your product or service. What's the channel? How are you creating demand? He called it customer relationships. What's your revenue model? Who are your partners? What kind of activities, resources do you need to execute? And what's the resulting cost structure? And these 9 boxes actually were put into a book called The Business Model Generation. Anybody read Osterwalder? You should all have it on your desk. And unlike the stuff I write, he writes in pictures, so therefore it's understandable and digestible. And Osterwalder, to me, was kind of the front end for my definition of what a startup is. So that was the other thing I never understood is, what is a startup? What is it we're supposed to be doing if I kind of think startups are searching? So I came up with a definition you should at least ponder. Definition of a startup is a temporary organization designed to search for a scalable and repeatable business model. And if you deconstruct that sentence, it's kind of interesting. Temporary organization means that there is no such thing as a 10-year-old startup. There's a 2-year-old startup attached to an 8-year-old failure, usually. And only half of you are laughing. And so, I used to think, startups were great. We could be a startup forever. Well, that's not the goal. Even though it's fun and there's, team and whatever, the goal of a startup is to become a large company. So therefore, a startup is a temporary organization designed to search. Well, wait a minute. I thought a startup is designed to build a product or get orders or get customers. Well, yes, but it's designed to do all that stuff and more. Because you need to figure out who's your channel, what's the segment, what's the right pricing, etc. It's the sum of all these things. And search for something repeatable and scalable. Repeatable means you could do it on Monday and do it on Wednesday, and the same activities actually work. And scalable means you put $1 in and you get $1.N out. Business model. All the components. So a startup is a temporary organization designed to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. Between the year 2000, when the 4 Steps to the Epiphany came out, and this year, we took everything we kind of knew on how to articulate that and put it in this book called The Startup Owner's Manual. Right. Chris could flog the book. I don't really care. But I now teach this at Stanford, at Berkeley, at Columbia. The National Science Foundation has adopted this book and the class around it as the standard for teaching scientists and engineers how to do startups in the United States. ARPA-E will adopt it later this year as well. Because we think if you follow a process we have now cracked the code for entrepreneurship, which is a huge claim.
Now, I'm going to ask you a question here. Because in
Can I exhale now? Was that?
You can exhale now.
Do you have another question, or should I thought we were going to do one for 40 minutes.
In Silicon Valley, the ethos is you just go out and do it.
Yeah.
You know, so you grab a couple of buddies, you go to a hackathon maybe, and you come up with something there, and you go out and do it. Can you actually educate or train people to be entrepreneurs? Because we get
great question.
People coming from all over the world asking us, what's the secret of Silicon Valley? How do we do this in, name our country? Can you teach people to be entrepreneurs?
Yes.
Oh.
And now the longer answer is, that's how I used to approach startups. Is just do it, right? The Nike logo. But it turns out that's not the most efficient way to go do it, and that's kind of a conundrum, because on day one, startups are a faith-based organization. Right? They're religious. If you don't have passion, if you don't have drive, if you don't have, I need to bring this vision into reality, you're going to fail as a founder anyway. You could be an employee, but unless you have that as a founder, you're going to fail. The mistake we make is confusing that faith with facts. And therefore, the goal of a smart founder is to turn the faith-based enterprise into a fact-based enterprise as quickly as possible. That's the disconnect. We, in fact, and our investors, in fact, allowed us to execute on faith because we wrote it down in Appendix A in that business plan without saying, great, all these are our hypotheses. I'm funding you based on these hypotheses. Great, I love you, and I love the market, and, I'm kind of guessing or felt good this morning or whatever, here's the check. But instead of believing the plan, we should have just assumed that the plan was a series of untested hypotheses, and that what your job is not just to execute, but to get out and turn every one of those hypotheses into facts as quickly as possible. Again, what are the hypotheses? They're the ones in the business model. Who are your customers? What's your pricing? What's the channel? Does your feature set match what the customers actually want? Product market fit. As quickly as you could do that, you'll discover of whether you were truly a visionary or were actually having a hallucination. And most of the time, you discover, surprise, I was actually hallucinating. And here's the other part we learned. The other part we learned is we lied to each other for the last 40 years that startups go from success to success by just executing the plan. How many of you have done a startup before as a founder? Most of you know that you actually go from failure to failure. And you survive by learning as quickly as possible. Yet we never institutionalized that failure is part of the process. In fact, if you kind of understand the old model, what would happen is, we'd go to alpha test, beta test, they hire a VP of sales somewhere along there, they'd look at the plan, they think the plan was given by God on a set of tablets because you were venture funded, they build a sales force to go do that. You'd have first customer ship, which was marketing's greatest, product for the entire length of the company because you'd have a great party, you'd create demand, and then you'd have your first board meeting post-launch. And VCs would be happy because look at all the ink we got, and TechCrunch wrote us up, and no one would ask anything about orders until the next board meeting. And they go, how are the numbers looking? And the great VP of sales, she'd say, what a great pipeline. Only some of you are laughing. And then another board meeting and how sales and pipeline, and depending on the economic climate, this would go on either for months or years, and then until one day, the VCs would, after hearing the word pipeline again, would collectively, I don't know how they do this, they go to school for this, cock one collective eyebrow, turn their head at about 15 degrees, and stare sideways at the CEO, who immediately knows, hire a new recruiter because we're in trouble in sales. The next board meeting you come in, and no one's sitting next to the VP of sales because the stench of death is in the room. And I don't know how they do that. There's a flaming sword over her head. And just as she says, how are you doing? Poof, she disappears, and a new VP of sales shows up. No one actually ever calculated, but the half-life of a VP of sales in a startup is probably about 12 months. In fact, they have a bummer of a birthmark. It's a bullseye in their back. Now, we do this process and everybody laughs because you recognize this. If you think what's been going on in the Valley for 40 years, is we simply were guessing about that plan. There were no facts involved in its construction. In fact, there were probably alcohol and drugs involved in its construction. What we now know is what we're really doing when we fire that VP of sales. Think about this. You think the new VP of sales comes in and says, hey, look at that old strategy that got her fired, let's go do more of that? No, the new VP of sales says, the other VP of sales, complete idiot. Let me tell you about our new strategy. And when that doesn't work for a while, by the way, they blame it on the head of marketing who gets fired next, right? Anybody ever been in that role? What we're doing every time we fire an executive in the old model is pivoting the plan. We're actually changing something about the business plan. We're saying perhaps we ought to change customer segments or pricing or change the features of the product. What we now understand is that instead of firing executives, we ought to fire the plan. And we call those pivots. And a pivot is a substantive change to one or more of the components of the business model before you start changing out people. Now, obviously, sometimes you don't have the right people in place, etc. But instead of saying, you know, our business plan, i.e. business model, was cast in stone, and all it is a failure of people to execute, we now say, listen, our hypotheses were probably wrong on day one. There's no reason on earth they should have been right. So what we're doing in a startup now is rapidly testing those hypotheses. And by the way, since I teach at Stanford, I use the word hypotheses a lot because, you know, they pay $50,000 a year to go hear that. But outside of Stanford, does anybody know what the word hypotheses means? Anybody? Guess. Guess. So a startup is a series of untested guesses. Think about that. As smart as you are, even if you're a domain expert, you know, coming from company X with the source code, coming from company X with ideas, and then going, some of you caught that, and then going to company Y, there's still a series of untested things you don't know. And if you're a typical founder today, there's a lot of stuff you don't know. So why don't we just assume that they're all a series of hypotheses you need to learn about quickly?
Now, if I can interrupt you again here. I looked at the Startup Genome
Yes.
project, and they look at thousands of startups,
Yes.
tens of thousands of startups,
Yes.
and gather information from them. They found that the most successful startups are the ones that either do no pivots or 2 or 3 pivots.
Yep.
If you've done more than 4, you're probably not going to be successful. What's your take on that?
Well, I love the Startup Genome guys. Max Marmert, one of the co-founders, I met him. He was... he actually got me incredibly depressed because when I met him at 18, he was already smarter than I was at 45, and it was just incredible. And I met him when he was so young. He was about to start Stanford. His father had to drive him to the meeting, I swear. And so Max was my student at Stanford for half a semester before he dropped out. So I think I contributed to the Peter Thiel model of doing startups. But if you really look at their database, it's almost all internet startups,
Yep.
which is great. And I suggest for those of you who haven't seen the Startup Genome data, just go on the web, type Startup Genome, and they actually have probably acquired the best database of early stage ventures of anybody. And full disclosure, I'm an investor in Max and his company. And so I think his data is kind of interesting, which says 2 things to me. One is the word pivot has rapidly become, you know, so overused and such a crutch for some class of entrepreneurs, which kind of translates to lack of patience. So for some, you know, our customers aren't behaving as we expected. Let's change our entire strategy in a week. The problem is the internet actually allows you to do that, and I think. It's a very dangerous thing to do without adult supervision. So, you know, in the web, there's nothing that stops you from changing your entire strategy in a short period of time.
But if it's customer-driven and responsive, why wouldn't you do that? If you're not getting the feedback that you think is good, why wouldn't you change to get better feedback?
You know, one of the interesting things about entrepreneurship is that as much as we now will start gathering a ton of data, accountants don't run startups and never will. And my apologies to any accountants who are running startups. I'll refund your entire fee today if you paid anything to get in. But entrepreneurship are still driven by artists. Every founder in this room is no longer an engineer or an MBA. You're an artist. Because it's not just looking at the raw data. Okay. It's actually understanding what the data means. It's actually getting some insight. And sometimes the insight is from the outliers. You know, 1,000 customers might be really excited on the web to pay $9.99 for your product. And you got thrown out by 2 people who said, too bad you're not charging $10,000 because I would have paid it if you would have just configured it like this. A great entrepreneur will listen to those outliers and fire the other 1,000 customers, potentially, and say there's a very different business here. And I think at least for a long time, entrepreneurship is still going to be driven by founders who are capable of deriving insight, which is a fancy word for really pattern recognition out of deep data. And that's what great entrepreneurs do. And so I don't think it's just simply listen to all your customers, put up the spreadsheet, and take the best, and here's what it added up to. I don't think it's ever going to be like that. You see companies like Zynga who have gotten their existing business to that, but that's not what it was like on day one. And confusing the current execution model with the instinct of how you kind of find those initial customers and what the pattern is what entrepreneurship is all about. It's what differentiates an early employee from a founder. It differentiates an early employee from someone who's a vision. If you really think about it, the best examples for me for founding entrepreneurs are actually a story about Michelangelo. You remember a story about Michelangelo? About 500 years ago, Florence, somebody went into a studio, saw a 12-foot block of marble. Michelangelo was just standing there, I think in Italian, said, "Isn't this the most beautiful statue you've ever seen, sculpture you've ever seen?" And like his guest is looking at a 12-foot block of marble. "What are you talking about? 12-foot block of marble." He said, "Come back in a couple of years." Guest comes back in a couple of years, next time he's through Florence. And there was the Pieta. And anybody ever see a picture of the Pieta or physically see it? Truly in Renaissance art, probably is the most beautiful sculpture ever done. And the visitor asked Michelangelo, "How did you do that?" And he said, "I just removed the stone around it." That's what founders do. Founders see that vision on day one, and they're just removing all the obstacles in the way between me and my vision, learning all the time, sometimes changing, sometimes figuring out, gee, the stone has a vein through it that I need to kind of go around, or gee, something else. But you have that vision, and you're just removing the obstacles in the way. That's how I always worked. Sometimes I was wrong, sometimes I had to change direction. But it wasn't like day one, more data. It was, here's where I'm heading. And I got to tell you, if you don't have that, be an early employee for someone who does. Don't do this at home unless you could see things that others can't.
Now, I'm going to challenge this a little bit because if you've read this morning's paper, you've got an opportunity to do that. Meebo was just acquired by Google. I don't know how much for, but that's a company that I met Seth Sternberg when he was at Stanford and Berkeley 6-7 years ago, and that was the 4th attempt to do a startup with that same team. And the only reason they got it going was because they got something going that they had to fix for themselves. They tried 3 times to fix a problem they thought was out there, to try to remove the stone from a problem they thought they saw and found it failed. They then fixed something for themselves and found suddenly, before they knew where they were, that the rest of the campus wanted to use this. It's now pivoted to something quite different and has obviously become valuable, so Google's bought it. So that seems to be a little bit different. They tripped over this. And it was only the customer feedback of the rest of the Stanford campus saying, can we use this, that made them realize, boy, we've actually got a startup on our hands.
I think those are actually the same version of the same story.
Okay.
I think, in fact, the Meebo story of building something that you want to use yourself is actually how the Valley got started. Is if you really think about it, the scientists and engineers were building things for people on the next bench, right? It was the next bench syndrome. Is you built one for yourself, and then someone else next to you said, "Gee, can I have one of those?" And so you built something else for them as well. That still works in the same way as, I see something no one else has, though this time I have more data on the front end.
Okay.
Right? So now the data is, people are giving me feedback that I'm on the right path. I still think that's exactly the same model.
Okay.
Right.
All right. I've got a bunch of questions here, but I don't know. Does anybody from the audience have a question for Steve I'd like to throw out?
Or else I'm capable of speaking for another 3 hours. So
There's a question at the back there. Can you stand up and give us your question?
Hi, Steve. I just read your last book, Regular Fireside.
Then it was my book that you read.
The part that I was struggling with a little bit, and there's several times you seem to focus too much on the customer validation and the fact that your initial customers have to tell you what this is a problem that is not going to tell on the need basis. And based on my own experience, I think a lot of customers quite frankly don't get it the first time. I mean, I think we almost have a basic example, like when we first saw the iPad, we were like, why would anyone want to use that?
Right.
And we have to be much faster on a laptop, and all the extra stuff on everybody's like,
Right. So this is a version of the Steve Jobs, thank you. This is a version of the Steve Jobs thing is, if I ask customers what they wanted, the blah, blah, blah. Or, the faster horse from Henry Ford. So part of this is something I had struggled with when I wrote the original 4 Steps to the Epiphany. Doing the 4 steps was easy. But trying to answer that question was really hard. Because sometimes that's true and sometimes it's not. Let me explain to you what I've discovered. I've discovered that, anybody ever hear the apocryphal story that Eskimos have 43 words for snow? Anybody ever hear that?
Yes.
Turns out it's not true, which I also found out, but it's great to use. Wet snow, dry snow, snow you fall through and the ice and the sharks get you, and, whatever kind of snow. It turns out that the equivalent is true in Silicon Valley. We only have one word for something called startup. And the problem is trying to apply all these methods to that one word actually is the mistake. It turns out, I believe, there are at least 4 types of startups, and there are different strategies for each. And let me explain. There's a startup entering an existing market. And let me define my definition of an existing market. Well, I'll let you define it. What's an existing market? What does it sound like? Yeah.
Already using it.
Yeah, so if being already used, what does that imply that's out there? Customers. What else? If you got customers.
Known business model, revenue.
Yeah. What else? Competition.
Yes.
Right. So you got users, and you got competition. Guess what? In an existing market, if you want to kick butt for existing competitors, how do you know what features to go do? Who do you ask?
Customers.
The existing customers. Guess what? It's an existing market. They could tell you the basis of competition. No, it's not about this, it's about this. They could tell you about pricing, they could tell you about features, etc. Customer development, it's genius. You look like a genius. Just get it out of your building and go ask people. Okay? Existing market, customer development works absolutely fine. It might be, though, in an existing market, there are incumbents who are either monopolists or duopolists, and the cost of entry on a direct head-on assault is prohibitive. So what you might want to do is figure out how to segment that market, that is, find a niche where you know something about a group of users or some features they require, or you might decide to enter an existing market by being a low-cost supplier, by going to China and just doing a pricing game. I call that second strategy resegmenting an existing market. Again, understanding customers and understanding all that stuff, absolutely essential. 4 Steps to Epiphany, best book you could ever buy. Startup Owner's Manual, absolutely. There's a third type, which I didn't understand when I first wrote the 4 Steps and do now, is if you're in India, Brazil, Russia, China, where the market size is north of 100 million people, there are cultural or regulatory barriers for American companies. You just clone an American business model. You could do your own Google, Facebook and whatever. It'll be years before the Americans go figure it out. Right? Almost like an existing market, buy the books, works great there. But the case you're talking about, and the one that Steve Jobs was talking about, is the hardest case. And that's what I call a new market. A new market, what's it sound like? Any users in there?
Nope.
Nope. Any competitors?
Nope.
Maybe other startups also, lost around the woods. Now, so the question in a new market, there's no users. So I guess the first instinct is, I'm going to lock myself up in a steel room, shut all the doors and windows, and just be a visionary and build the product until it comes out, never talking to anybody. That is one approach. I happen to call it the going out of business approach. Right? But you could call it, I'm a visionary, right? I will suggest that the customer development process you want to use there is the same in the point of getting out of the building. It's the questions are different. Instead of asking people which features they want, what you really need to understand is which part of their day are you replacing. Because unless you know something I don't, people don't have more than 24/7 and have a finite amount of money and things they're doing. You're going to probably be replacing something. So I'll give you one example. I want to understand, I get it, new market, etc. Tell me what people are doing today and what you're going to be a substitute for and why. Tell me how you're going to enter this market. Tell me how you're going to tip the market from the existing incumbents or the existing usage. Why are people going to change? That's a very different story than entering an existing market. And I'll give you a particular. I don't know if people remember, but when Steve Jobs was alive, he lived in Palo Alto. I lived about a mile in the other direction, thank God. But when the first Apple stores opened, I would see Steve Jobs in the Palo Alto Apple store at least once a month. Now, it never struck me, literally for years, until one day I said, hey, I wonder why Steve Jobs can't get a computer delivered to his house. What the hell is he doing in the Apple Palo Alto store? What do you think he was doing?
Talking to customers.
Yeah, or at least watching them, right? At least watching them. And does anyone remember when he was alive, he would write or respond to at least one email a month, right? There'd be an email citing. Most of it said no or fuck you to, a customer. Do you know no one in the press ever asked, is this the only email he read this month? No one ever asked that, right? And my best friend, John Rubenstein, was his head of hardware engineering for 13 years through Next and Apple. And John couldn't go to the bathroom when he returned from a trip from Japan or China. In terms of what new technology did you see? What new products did you see? Tell me how we're going to use this in something else. Even Steve Jobs, who Apple PR people would love to have you think he was sitting in a Zen Lotus position in a lead-lined room thinking of great ideas, was actually completely immersed in culture, what people were doing, etc. And so this is a long answer to customer development really changes based on market type. Right? And so the first thing you need to ask yourself constantly is, what type of market am I entering? Is it existing? Am I resegmenting one? Or am I taking a real visionary approach and trying to do something new? And by the way, if I'm trying to do something new, just think about the amount of funding you need. Funding changes per market type. Market entry strategies change per market type. And so market type is an integral part of the customer development process. I hope this long soliloquy kind of helped you think about how I'm thinking.
Okay, question in the middle there. Yes, sir.
Extending on that, is the distinction really between asking customers, you're hearing about wants, watching them, you're learning about needs, even though they don't appreciate they have the need.
Okay, so the question is, are you asking, is there a difference between asking customers what they want and watching customers to see what they're doing?
So,
Watching is
yes.
asking you're hearing a want.
So
Okay.
for me, the ultimate test, I do it to my students, I finally did it to myself in my last couple of startups, is can you explain the day in the life of a customer? And I don't mean at work. Tell me where they live, what do they drive to work, what are they listening to, when they turn on their computer or use a mobile device, what other apps are on there, that is, do you understand them enough, can you draw archetypes of customers, etc.? Some of that data is gathered by asking them questions. Some of it's observing them. But you need to be the customer. And by be the customer, this is not will you buy the product. This is you need to understand what their life will be like before and after. And if you can't do that role, here's a pen, go up to the whiteboard, you got a half hour. And if you can't talk to me a half hour about those customers, what they do, what will they do before and after, how do they live, etc., you don't have enough data. And does that answer your question? And so it's a combination of, yes, some of it's asking, some of it's observing, some of it's actually doing. So, for example, by my last company, or at least the one I did where I was building supercomputers, my customers were some of the most advanced researchers in a series of esoteric markets: computational fluid dynamics, computational chemistry, reservoir simulation, etc. I could not only use all the software they could use, I could actually read all their papers and understand at least the abstracts and have conversations with them about their particular domains. And then understand, finally, after I did that, how will this type of computer be useful to them in their research, and understand how much time it would save for what they do on a daily basis. There was no way I could have done that by saying, here's a machine, here's the price, here's whatever. Does that help? All right.
Time for one last question.
Who has the best question? Who's the best question? Yeah, who's the best question?
Is the best? Okay, Bill, do you want to ask a question? Come on.
Do I get to ask?
You get to ask the best question.
I just want to understand what kind of business is Twitter, and does it have a business model, and is it something we should be thinking about when we're starting or funding our businesses today?
Okay, so the question is, what kind of business is Twitter? Does it have a business model, and should we be thinking about this sort of thing when we're looking at companies that we're considering funding?
I'm just an old-fashioned...
This is a question from a venture capitalist. He's got no clue what he's doing.
Right. I hope there's no press people in the room, or that your limiteds aren't here. I learned this from Fred Wilson, because I grew up in the Old Valley where you kind of charged for stuff on day one, right? And okay, we built something and you gave me money for that. And I kind of understood that business model. And it was actually both understanding Fred Wilson's investing strategy, I think, and at least a couple of years ago, and understanding the business model canvas and the Google strategy that helped me understand this. So if you think about a business model, and I'm going to use Google as an example, and we get back into Twitter. How many of you use Google? Right? All right. How many of you pay for the search? Really? Well, Google's the most profitable software company on the planet. Where are they making their money from? I'm sorry? Great. So wait a minute. There's another customer segment. So if you think about customers, in Google's search model, there are users and there are payers. So now if we're drawing the business model, there are two groups. And if you think about the product you see as users, it's the search bar, right? What do the advertisers see? AdWords. They see a completely different value proposition, different product. Wait a minute. You pay $0. What do the advertisers pay? How do they pay? What's their pricing? Per click. So now, in a multi-sided market, which this is, there are multiple customer segments, there are multiple value propositions, and there are multiple revenue models. And so for the Twitter, Google, etc. model, there was a new business model, which actually turned out, I'll tell you, that's so new, it's 180 years old, that says, let's get tens of millions of users, and we could monetize them by finding advertisers, in this case, who will pay for the privilege of reaching them. Does anybody know why it's 180 years old? Who was the first people to figure this out? Newspapers, 1830s. Radio, 1920s. Television, 1950s. Right? So the Twitter model, to me, has multiple plays. Once you start drawing the business model canvas, it's really kind of interesting, because now you can use yellow stickies that says, okay, there are plays that if I get tens and hundreds of millions of users, there are alternate monetization strategies that I can now try to figure out who my payers are. Gee, that was one I just didn't believe in, being an old hardware guy and semiconductor guy. I built something, you pay me for it. This is really the newspaper broadcast, thousands to one. So Google might have, hundreds of millions of users. I bet you they have tens of thousands of payers that matter, right? So that ratio is really kind of interesting, maybe 100,000. And by the way, their distribution channel is even different, right? For users, you just come to their website. For payers, they actually have sales forces that go out and get major corporations to buy keywords. And so I'm not going to answer your Twitter questions, because if I knew that, I'd have your job. And I don't. I'm not smart enough to have your job. But there are new business models that are kind of reincarnations of others instead of, and so I've gone from skeptical, I don't understand this either, to, oh, I get this. This is a monetization strategy based on a multi-sided market. By the way, my favorite one, and I'm going to just segue this to the last part of this answer, is once I understood two-sided markets, I was able to understand, multi-sided markets, like where there are 5 or 6 sides. I'll give you an example. I have students who build medical devices. Anybody have a relative who ever had a hip or shoulder replaced? Yeah? Who was the customer? The doctor, of course, right? Oh, did the doctor have the device inserted in them? Well, did the doctor pay for the device? Well, who paid for the device? Insurance company. Is the insurance company the customer? Insurance company is somewhere in that customer segment. So you got doctors, you got patients. Anybody else involved? Who? Hospital. Great, because in a hospital you can't put in any hip. You have some committee that, okay, so now a hospital is a customer segment. Anybody else involved?
FDA.
FDA. In the United States, you just can't randomly make a hip in your garage, though that's a thought. Right? So wait a minute. You want to talk about business models with lots of sides? Start thinking about medical devices and others. And now you've got to deal with every one of those customer segments, have a different value proposition, have a different revenue model. You think the FDA is free? Anybody know how long it takes to do a 510K or PMA? Yeah? Could be, if you're lucky, 6 months. If you're not lucky, 5 years. Right? So now all of a sudden there are all these moving parts. Drawing a business model and then doing customer development against each one of them allows you to understand the process. And this thing, now the plug, actually takes all the stuff we used to kind of know as heuristics and writes them down. Right? Writes them down. This is a reference manual. It's not a novel. For God's sake, your smoke will come out of your ears if you try to read the entire thing. But most of the sentences are finished in this version. So thank you very much for your time, and I really enjoyed it.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you. We're going to take a short break now. There's a short coffee break, so please help yourself to some coffee and go and see the companies that have set themselves up. And we'll be back in 15 minutes when we will have 3 of the alumni companies tell us about their experiences. Thank you very much.